year was 1099, the burning heart of the First Crusade. The world was drenched in the smoke of faith and fury, and every mile from Europe to the Holy Land had been marked by blood. Among the hundreds of knights who rode under the blazing cross, one name whispered through the ranks: Sir Aldric of Lyon. He was neither the oldest nor the youngest, but he carried a look in his eyes that spoke of something beyond war, a flame of belief that refused to die even as men around him fell like leaves before the scythe. The sun rose over the dusty hills of Judea, its light pouring down upon an army of weary souls, Christians from every corner of Europe, battered, starved, and yet still marching toward Jerusalem. Their armor had dulled, their banners were torn, but their hearts burned with one commandment: to reclaim the holy city from the infidels. As the gates of Jerusalem glimmered faintly in the far-off haze, Aldric tightened his grip on his sword and whispered a prayer under his breath. The march had been a torment. Many had died in the deserts of Anatolia. Some had turned back. The air reeked of sweat, blood, and faith. Every night the campfires were surrounded by men muttering half prayers, half sobs. But now, as the holy city neared, the suffering seemed to fade beneath the weight of destiny. When the Crusaders finally reached the walls of Jerusalem, they found them towering and impenetrable. The Saracen defenders lined the ramparts, archers ready, watching silently. The Crusaders' leaders, Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Tancred, gathered on a small rise overlooking the city. Aldric stood among the men below, listening as the leaders spoke in grim tones. Godfrey's voice carried through the wind. "Brothers of Christ, this is the city where our Savior walked, where he was crucified and rose again. The Lord himself has brought us here, but he will not hand victory to the faithless. We must earn it. Tomorrow we take Jerusalem or we die before its gates." The men answered with a low roar. Swords were raised and the cross of Christ flashed above their heads. Aldric's heart pounded. That night, as he sat near the campfire, he watched the flickering flames dance like ghosts of fallen brothers. Across from him sat another knight, a young man named Thomas of York, his armor dented, his eyes weary but sharp. "You think we'll live to see the sunrise over that city?" Thomas asked quietly. Aldric looked toward the dark outline of the walls. "If God wills it. I've seen death follow us like a shadow. Maybe he brought us here not to live but to be remembered." Thomas smiled faintly. "Then let us make sure we die well." The next morning the assault began. The Crusaders surged toward the city like a storm. Siege towers groaned as they rolled forward. Arrows rained down like hail, and the cries of men in steel tore through the air. Aldric charged with his unit, his sword raised high, his voice joining the battle cry of thousands. "Deus vult! God wills it." The Saracen archers loosed their arrows with deadly precision. Men fell screaming around him, impaled or burned alive as boiling oil poured from the ramparts. Aldric reached the base of the wall, pressing against the rough stone, panting, hearing the screams echo above him. A flaming arrow struck a nearby siege tower, setting it ablaze. The flames swallowed men whole as they scrambled to escape. But amid the chaos, Aldric saw something: the cross banner of Godfrey's men rising on the hill. Reinforcements were coming. Hope surged through his veins like fire. He grabbed a ladder, slammed it against the wall, and began to climb. Each rung was slick with blood, each breath heavier than the last. Above, a Saracen warrior appeared, sword flashing. Aldric blocked the strike, his arm trembling, then drove his blade through the man's chest. The body tumbled down, crashing into the ground below. At the top, he hauled himself onto the parapet. The wall was a storm of blades. Crusaders and defenders clashed in a deadly dance, screams and shouts mingling with the clang of iron. Aldric fought like a man possessed, his sword rising and falling. His armor splattered with blood, both his and others. Then he saw it, the black banner of the Fatimid defenders, flying high above the Tower of David. That was the symbol of their command. Aldric's eyes locked on it. If we take that tower, the city falls, he thought. He signaled to Thomas and a handful of men. Together they cut through the defenders, step by step, pushing toward the tower. But fate was cruel. A catapult stone slammed into the wall nearby, shattering it. The explosion threw Aldric and Thomas backward. Dust filled the air. Aldric coughed, disoriented, blood dripping from his brow. He heard Thomas's voice faintly, shouting his name, then a scream. When the dust cleared, Thomas lay impaled on a broken spear. Aldric crawled to him, grasping his hand. "Hold on," Aldric whispered. Thomas smiled weakly. "You'll see it. The Holy Sepulchre. Promise me." "I promise," Aldric said, voice breaking. Thomas's eyes dimmed. Aldrich closed them, his hands trembling. Around him, the battle still raged. He looked to the heavens and screamed, "For Christ, for the fallen!" and charged again. Hours turned into eternity. Blood soaked the stones. But the Crusaders pressed on. They breached the northern gate. The defenders began to falter. By nightfall, the city's outer walls were broken, and the Crusaders swarmed into Jerusalem like a tide of vengeance. The streets burned. The sky glowed orange as temples, homes, and towers went up in flames. Aldrich stumbled through the chaos, half dead, sword dragging at his side. He reached the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and fell to his knees, tears mixing with the blood on his face. Around him, knights prayed, wept, and sang hymns. The city had fallen. Jerusalem was theirs, but in Aldrich's heart, victory felt hollow. The cries of the dying echoed in the sacred air. He looked upon the altar and whispered, "Is this what you wanted, Lord? This fire and ruin?" Outside, the bells rang. The Crusaders raised their banners high. Godfrey himself rode through the streets, his voice carrying over the noise. "Jerusalem is free. God has given us his city." The men cheered, but Aldrich felt the weight of every soul lost along the way pressing upon him. As night descended over the conquered city, he walked through the silent alleys past bodies of both friend and foe. Somewhere behind him the fire still burned. He stopped near a broken wall, sat down, and gazed toward the stars. He remembered Thomas's words, "You'll see the Holy Sepulchre." He had kept his promise, but the cost was unbearable. He unsheathed his sword, staring at the reflection of the flames upon the blade, and for the first time he wondered if the true battle had just begun, the one within his soul. The wind whispered through the ruins, carrying with it the scent of ash and incense. Aldrich closed his eyes. "Stories of valor," he murmured softly. "May they remember us not for what we destroyed, but for what we believed." And somewhere far from the walls of Jerusalem, in the lands they had left behind, mothers, wives, and children would soon hear the news. The city of God had been taken. But none would ever truly understand the price their sons had paid to make it so. The dawn after the siege was quiet. The sun rose blood red over the city's golden stones. Aldrich stood at the gates, armor dented, hands trembling. Behind him, the Crusaders knelt in prayer. Ahead of him, the horizon stretched toward an uncertain peace. For the moment, Jerusalem belonged to the cross, but the silence that followed the storm carried the weight of something eternal. As the bells tolled, Aldrich whispered once more to the heavens, "Forgive us." The dawn after Jerusalem's fall was painted in crimson and gold, but the beauty of the sunrise did little to wash away the stench of death that hung over the city. Smoke still rose from the streets. The cries of the wounded and the mourning echoed through the stone alleys. The Crusaders had won, but the victory had carved deep scars into every man who survived. Sir Aldrich of Lyon walked through the holy city as though moving through a dream. His armor was cracked, his hands trembling, and his eyes hollow. The streets that had once been the heart of faith now ran red with blood. Bodies of Saracen defenders and Crusaders alike lay together, indistinguishable in death. The Holy Land had become a graveyard of believers from both sides. Aldrich passed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre once more. Inside, knights knelt in prayer, their swords laid across the floor before them. Some wept, some smiled, some simply stared into nothingness. He looked toward the altar, where the light of dawn filtered through the cracked glass. For a brief moment it painted the stone walls with golden rays, as if heaven itself mourned the cost of this holy conquest. A soft voice behind him broke the silence. "You look as though you've seen the end of the world, Sir Knight." Aldrich turned. It was a priest, his white robe stained with soot and ash. His name was Father Benoit, one of the few priests who had journeyed with them from France. "The end of the world," Aldrich said quietly, "would be merciful compared to what I have seen." The priest nodded solemnly. "God's work often passes through human hands, and those hands are rarely clean." Aldrich's jaw tightened. "We were told this would be holy, that God would smile upon our swords. And do you think he has not?" Aldrich looked around the broken church, the shattered icons, the blood upon the stone. "If this is God's smile, Father, then I fear his tears." The priest's eyes softened. "Faith is not in victory, my son. It is in what you carry after the victory. What will you do now that the city is ours?" Aldrich hesitated. He had not thought beyond the walls. The crusade had been his life, his purpose, his burden. Now the battle was over, and all that remained was silence. don't know," he admitted. Father Benoit placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then listen. God speaks loudest in silence." The priest walked away, leaving Aldrich alone with the echo of his words. That night, the Crusaders celebrated. Fires burned, music rose, and laughter filled the streets. Gold and spoils were divided among the knights. Godfrey of Bouillon, their leader, refused to be called king, saying no man should wear a crown in the city where Christ had worn thorns. Instead, he called himself defender of the Holy Sepulchre. To many, it was an act of humility. To others, a reminder that this conquest was meant to serve faith, not glory. Aldrich stood apart from the feast, watching the revelry from the shadows. Thomas's sword hung from his belt now, a symbol of the friend who had fallen before seeing the dawn. He thought of the men who had marched beside him, who had starved in the deserts, who had died at the gates. The joy of the others felt distant, hollow. Then he saw her. A figure moved through the ruins beyond the firelight. A young woman, wrapped in a tattered shawl, carrying a small bundle. Her steps were slow, cautious. Aldrich followed quietly, his hand resting on his sword hilt out of instinct, though his heart told him there was no danger. She stopped at the edge of a collapsed house, knelt and began clearing debris with trembling hands. Beneath the stones lay another body, a man, his robes marking him as a local merchant. The woman began to weep softly. The bundle in her arms shifted, a child barely a year old. Aldrich froze. The scene struck something deep inside him. All the sermons about glory, all the shouts of Deus Vult seemed to dissolve in that moment. This was the cost. He stepped forward slowly, lowering his sword. "Wait," he said gently. The woman spun, fear flashing in her eyes. She clutched the child close, whispering something in Arabic. A plea, perhaps. "I won't harm you," Aldrich said, removing his helmet. His voice was weary but sincere. "He was your husband?" She stared at him, uncomprehending. But when he gestured toward the body and then to her heart, she nodded. Tears streaked her face. Aldrich knelt beside her, helping lift a fallen beam. Together they uncovered the man's body. The woman bowed her head and whispered a prayer in her tongue. Aldrich bowed his too, not understanding the words but understanding the grief. When it was done, he looked at the child, tiny, frail, but alive. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small silver cross, placing it on the ground beside the man. "For him," he said quietly, "so God will know he died in his city." The woman looked at the cross, then at him. For a moment their eyes met. No longer Crusader and Saracen, but two broken souls in a world of ashes. She whispered something softly, almost like a blessing, and then disappeared into the shadows with her child. Aldrich sat there long after she was gone. The moon rose above the city, pale and silent. In the days that followed, he began to wander the streets, helping bury the dead, tending to the wounded, speaking to no one. Some of his fellow knights mocked him, saying he had gone soft, that he was bewitched by the city's sorrow. Others avoided him altogether. But Aldrich no longer cared. The war had burned away everything that wasn't real, and all that remained was the quiet truth that every life, Christian or Muslim, was precious in the eyes of the same God. One morning, he stood on the Temple Mount overlooking the city. The golden stones glimmered under the rising sun. Father Benoit found him there once more. "You've changed, Aldrich," the priest said softly. "Perhaps," Aldrich replied, "or perhaps I've only now begun to see." "What do you see?" "I see men killing each other in the name of the same Creator," he said bitterly. "I see fire where there should be prayer. I see blood where there should be faith." The priest sighed. "You see the truth of mankind, but do not mistake it for the truth of God." Aldrich turned to him. "Then what does God want from us, Father? To fight forever? To conquer in his name while forgetting his mercy?" Benoit looked at him with sadness in his eyes. "No, my son. God wants us to learn that mercy is the greatest victory. Perhaps that is the lesson he sent you here to find." That night, Aldrich made his decision. He could no longer be a knight of conquest. The holy city had been reclaimed, but his soul felt empty. He went to Godfrey's camp and requested permission to leave. "Leave?" Godfrey asked, surprised. "Now, when we need men to defend what we have taken?" Aldrich bowed his head. "I came to serve God, my lord, but I have come to believe he does not live in walls or crowns. He lives in the hearts of those who show mercy. My sword has done enough." Godfrey studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then go, Sir Aldrich. You have fought with honor, May you find peace where this city could not give it." Aldrich thanked him, removed his sword belt and laid it upon the table. He kept only Thomas's blade, tying it across his back. As he left the city, the wind carried the sound of distant chanting, prayers rising from both churches and mosques. The holy city was divided, yet in that moment it seemed united by the same longing for peace. Days turned into weeks. Aldrich wandered through the hills of Judea, helping pilgrims, tending to the poor, seeking not redemption but understanding. He found small villages ravaged by war, people of both faiths living in fear. He offered his sword to protect them, but never again to kill. One evening, as the sun dipped below the desert horizon, he sat by a small fire looking up at the stars. A caravan approached, traders from the north. Among them was a young woman with a child. When she saw him, she stopped, her eyes widening. It was her, the woman from Jerusalem. The child was older now, walking beside her. She smiled faintly, placing a hand over her heart. Aldrich stood, unsure what to say. She spoke first, her voice soft. "You remember?" "Yes," he said, his voice trembling. "I remember." She reached into her cloak and pulled something out, the silver cross he had left by her husband's grave. She handed it to him. "You gave this. Now I return it. My husband would want you to keep it." Aldrich stared at the cross, the moonlight glinting off its surface. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said, "Peace, knight." "That is what we both sought," he nodded. "Peace." They parted ways, but the memory of that meeting would stay with him forever. Years later, tales of the First Crusade spread across Europe, stories of heroes, victories, and divine triumph. Bards sang of the knights who had conquered Jerusalem, of Godfrey's courage, of the sacred banners flying over the holy city. But among those who listened, few knew the name of Sir Aldrich of Lyon. He was not in the songs nor the chronicles. He lived quietly, tending to travelers and orphans near Antioch, far from the courts and battlefields. Yet those who met him said he carried an aura of calm, as if he had seen heaven and hell and learned that both lived within man's heart. One night, near the end of his days, he sat outside a small chapel he had built with his own hands. The air was cool, the sky bright with stars. A young squire sat beside him, eager for stories. "Tell me, master," the boy said. "You were in Jerusalem. You fought for God's city. Was it glorious?" Aldrich smiled faintly, eyes distant. "Glorious?" he repeated. "Yes, perhaps, but not for the reasons men think. Glory is not in the taking of a city, boy. It's in the keeping of your soul when the world around you burns." The boy frowned. "Did we do right then? In the crusade?" Aldrich looked up at the heavens. "We did what men always do when they try to speak for God. We bled, we killed, we prayed. But maybe the lesson was never in victory. Maybe it was in learning that even in war, mercy is the only path that leads home." He closed his eyes, feeling the wind brush against his face. The bells of the chapel rang softly in the distance. For the first time in years, he felt peace. And as dawn broke over the quiet hills, Sir Aldrich of Lyon passed away in his sleep. A knight of the First Crusade, a soldier of faith, and a man who had finally found the meaning of God's will. In Jerusalem, long after his death, a wandering monk found an old inscription carved into a wall near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The words were simple: "May our swords be silent and our hearts remember, for in mercy lies true valor." Below it were 3 faintly etched words, "Stories of Valor," and thus, his story lived on, not as a tale of conquest, but as a testament that even in the blood-soaked heart of history, compassion could bloom. The Holy Land would be fought over again and again, but somewhere in its stones, perhaps a fragment of Aldrich's prayer remained, whispering across centuries that faith without mercy is only another form of war. The winds of Jerusalem carried that whisper still.